The GT 1030 is probably my favorite GPU. It combines all the advantages of a modern architecture with a small power consumption, small size, and a cheap price. When you can find it on its original price, that is, what the heck is happening on the US? But the 1030 is not the only GPU that can claim all of those advantages. On the AMD side, we have the RX 550, its most direct equivalent. Which one is better? I have already talked at length at how this tier is pretty good on 1080 with some tweaks, so let's push them a bit further. How will this GPU do on 4K? Now that is way more interesting. In order to find out, I have recruited the help of the EposVox Tech and Education channel, who will tackle the Nvidia side while I do AMD. Which option will come out on top? It's time for a...
Battle of Budget GPUs in 4K!
Thanks for the intro. I'm EposVox, and this is Nvidia's GT 1030. This is more or less the current generation's most entry-level, low-end gaming-focused graphics card. The 1030 is available in quite a few variants in terms of video ports and cooling. It's typically a single-slot card, with models like mine providing a small heatsink and fan, some with a beefy heatsink and no fan, and even an overclocked dual-slot model with a full massive cooler. Some have dual DVI ports, some have dual DisplayPort ports, and my MSI model features a DisplayPort and HDMI output, which is a nice balance there. The single-slot cards also usually come with small form factor brackets, so you can put it in smaller PCs, such as this HP Compact Pro 6200 that I picked up on eBay for only $82. Not bad. My little HP here boasts a quad-core Intel Core i5 2400 and 4GB of RAM. The operating system is running off a cheapo 240GB SSD, and the games are running from a standard 7200 RPM hard drive. I also installed a $5 light in the front of the case, just for a little flair. Despite being a tiny office PC, this HP is super easy to take apart, upgrade, tinker with, and so on. The GT 1030 is actually capable of 4K 60Hz output and gaming, though with some questionable value in doing so, and I wanted to put this budget rig to the test against Alex's budget rig with an RX 550 to see how we fare against each other. We ran a few games for comparisons using the lowest settings and a few special low-spec configs as well. All games are targeting 4K ultra high definition resolution with no lower scaling. Let's start with Counter-Strike Global Offensive, where we just ran the lowest settings on the benchmark map. CSGO was surprisingly playable with an average FPS of about 50 and a max around 80 FPS. Multi-core rendering made no difference here. The only major hiccup was at the start of the benchmark where there was a lot of smoke designed to really punish the game, but in terms of actual gameplay it should play out fine. Dragon Ball FighterZ, again at the lowest settings, hit an average of 42 FPS and maxed around 48 FPS, which provided a fairly consistent and enjoyable experience. It's a fairly easy to run game with many core animations specifically running at 15 FPS to, emulate the anime, so no surprises there. Returning to Devil May Cry 4 in the special edition was fun. It's been a while since I've looked at that game. For this, we used the lowest settings and a modded EXE that removed depth of field and motion blur. Back like the original release I remember. Running through the benchmarks, the average frame rates held up around 41 FPS. Not ideal, but playable and still cool to see this baby GPU handle it at 4K. Rocket League is so addicting. I might have lost a lot of time playing this for a few hours. Whoops. Turning everything except render quality down, as this is actually a resolution scaler, the game averaged around 36 FPS with a max of 45 FPS and a minimum of 21 FPS, though that was usually during the goal explosion, where every system hiccups there. Definitely playable and enjoyable, hence the amount of time I lost here. Metal Gear Solid 5 is a tough cookie to run at 4K, even on higher end machines. That means we needed to put the settings on the lowest possible option and use a modded 0.dat file, which completely disables shadows on the low option. Even with this, the average FPS in-game hit 25 FPS and barely reached any higher with a max of 33 FPS. Not a great experience, to be honest. Lastly, we tested Grand Theft Auto 5, or what I call the benchmark game. To run this at 4K, the settings were dropped as low as possible, and then the settings.xml file, located in Documents, Rockstar Games, Grand Theft Auto 5, was edited to set shadow quality value to 0 to disable shadows. Running the internal benchmark of the game nets us an average of 30 FPS, and a strange max of 112 FPS, and then a minimum of just 12 FPS. Lots of variation there. Looks like smaller indoor areas will run very smooth, but fast driving through the big city may cause some hiccups. So yes, the GT 1030 is actually capable of 4K gaming, and if you select your games carefully and apply some tweaks, you can actually play on 4K as long as you limit it to 30 FPS, if you can find it for the original MSRP. When I bought the card, it was $72 US shipped to my door. That puts it at a very good place for super cheap gaming and makes it a compelling upgrade for these older office or home PCs. But here in the USA, the graphics card market is very thrown out of whack, and this same card can cost you over $100 US, sometimes closer to $140, which is just not worth it. In some countries, such as Spain for example, the price has not changed that much and the card is definitely worth it. But if you're in a country where the GT 1030's price has inflated to be near or the same as the GTX 1050, it's definitely not worth it at that point.
Okay, my turn. AMD's current GPU architecture is Vega, but there are no standalone entry-level GPUs using it. The closest you can get is integrated graphics on APUs. So let's dial it back to the previous generation, the 500 series. The most entry-level GPU that you can get there as a consumer product is the RX 550. As you can imagine, it comes in a variety of sizes and configurations, some even with 4 gigs of VRAM, although I did not see any passively cool ones. I settled for the cheapest one, with 2 gigs of VRAM. I recently got this motherboard and first generation i5 750 quad-core PC for another project for less than 60 euros, but with a cheap case and a power supply, it will do well for testing. First, Counter-Strike Global Offensive. If you remember, the GT 1030 managed to provide an average of about 50 FPS, while the average of the RX 550 is very close to 60. That is more of a difference than I expected. 60 FPS on 4K is no joke. How did the other games do? Dragon Ball FighterZ, an amazingly performing game in general, maintained an average of 44 FPS, so very close to the GT 1030's results. It is worth noting that of all games tested, this is the most recent, so it might be that on newer games the difference between these two is going to be less. Now let's try Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition. The changes to the modded.exe on this game come from the standalone video I did on the matter. I literally did those changes hoping for a chance to test this game on 4K at some point. And the results are interesting. The average seems to be about 5 FPS more than the GT 1030, and I think I'm beginning to see a pattern here. Rocket League is super tricky to benchmark correctly for comparisons, but once again, this was a win for the RX 550. There's still drops when certain heavy effects happen, but the game is surprisingly fluid. Hard to believe this is running in full 4K. Now, Metal Gear Solid 5 with shadows disabled using the video in the corner did a fair bit better. While Epos saw a perfectly playable 25 FPS average that makes for a great experience if you're not picky, the RX 550 actually pushes it to a surprising average of 33 FPS. Heck, the game maintains 30 FPS on most times. 4K Metal Gear Solid 5 at 30 FPS on a budget GPU. Now that is something that I did not expect to see ever. Finally, in case you were not convinced, GTA 5 with shadows disabled did a great average of 30 FPS, and sometimes much more. There are drops here and there, but overall the game is actually fluid and playable at full 4K, another big surprise. So should we proclaim the RX 550 the absolute winner? hold your horses. If you can find a GPU close to its supposed sale price, it is actually cheaper than a GT 1030. In practice, however, it can be a bit tricky. The US Amazon store has the 2GB RX 550 at $115, while, as Epos mentioned, the cheapest GT 1030 is somewhere between $109 and $115. Seriously, what the heck is even happening there? In Spanish Amazon at the time of writing, the GT 1030 had not increased that much from the €80 that I paid for it, while the RX 550 can be found at a similar price. Heck, I bought it for $70! I was not even hunting for an offer, it was just like that, one day.
So if you can find the RX 550 cheaper or close to the GT 1030, it will be a much better option on 4K or even at 1080p. But if the GT 1030 is much cheaper, it can make for a decent substitute.
Yep, that seemed to be the gist of it. And with either GPU, you can surprisingly get away with playing some rather modern games on full 4K, if you're willing to apply some graphical tweaks or just be patient. Who would have thought? Thank you to Epos for helping me out, seriously, go check his channel, he is really good. And thank you to dear Patreon contributors for their constant support.